My name is Bodie Williamson, and I'm interviewing Rex Frazier. He's my grandpa on my mom's side of the family. This interview will talk about what his life was like from 1964 through 1973 and how the Vietnam War affected the way of life during that time. So first off, just give me a kind of like a rundown of what you do right now and what your living is right now.
Okay, right now I live in Kaysville. Um, I work full time in the winters as a ski instructor at Deer Valley Resort, and in the summer times, up until 2 years ago, I drove a cement mixer and retired from that. So now I'm not obligated to work in the summertime, and try to stay in good, reasonable physical shape to ski in the winters.
So, when the Vietnam War started, you were only around 5 years old, but what was like your very first ever experience with the war and how did that affect your life?
Probably the first experience was seeing network news. Um, at that time it was kind of a staple to watch the national network news. Walter Cronkite, uh, and they had coverage of the Vietnam War. So that was really kind of my first exposure. Not personally involved, but hearing the news reports of it.
How was that like mentally for you? Like, because you probably weren't super old when you heard that, but like, was there any like,
I don't know that it really affected me other than something that we grew up with. Just knew that it was there and that it was a possibility that if it was still going when we were older, we could get drafted and go. The draft at that time was pretty much mandatory for everybody unless you had a school deferment or something like that. So it always kind of loomed in the back of my mind. Uh, the late 50s, we were aware of people, celebrities like Elvis, that got drafted out of their regular careers and went into the military service. So it was just kind of a way of life.
when you were in high school, how did you talk about the war and like the population of the high school? Uh, like, what were people's opinions? Were they joking around about it or sad about it?
Well, my experience at high school at the time, it was mandatory for males to take ROTC during our sophomore year. So we had to wear a uniform 1 day a week to school, and I'm fairly indoctrinated into the military lifestyle because it just was required for everybody to do it. So I would say that kind of the overall attitude was that if drafted, I'd serve, and certainly not animosity toward the military. We just kind of grew up with it, especially in Ogden, where it was kind of a military town.
Was the ROTC like, so it was mandatory for everyone, but was it like something that most people liked, and how were people's opinions on having to be mandatory for that?
Um, I don't think there was an opinion on whether it was mandatory or not. It just was. Nobody really argued against it. It was all voluntary if you wanted to keep going after your sophomore year in high school. And I would say there were a handful of people that stayed with it through their whole high school experience. The vast majority did the sophomore year and then were out of it. But I think just with that experience, um, kind of the overall attitude was that military was an honorable course and not a lot of negative about it. As far as the war itself, I think kind of that attitude kind of was the same there. If drafted and had to go, you'd go, and it probably wasn't until I was like the last year or so of high school that anybody even tolerated any negative comments about the war. We were for the most part, kind of gung-ho and conservative, and looked down on people that were negative about the Vietnam War or any other branch of the military.
You said that you went on an LDS mission to Texas, but during this time, lots of members of the church weren't able to go on a mission. So how many people from your ward got to go on missions, and how did that affect people's views on the war, like from the church?
Well, there were no restrictions on going on missions at that time, so I think most of the guys my age went. I don't know, in my ward there were maybe 15 or 20 males that were on mission at the same time, but and I don't know that there was any correlation between that and the Vietnam War military experience, other than you could get a diversion or a deferral from the draft at that time if you were on a mission and you were actually considered an ordained minister. So it wasn't used as anything to drive to get out of the draft. It just was.
So kind of going along with the mission, how did you, like, what was an experience that you had there that helped you, like, be prepared for, because later on we'll talk about how you were in the National Guard. How did that prepare you for, like, getting into your service?
I don't know that there was any real correlation. Just just 2 years out of my life that I was on a mission, and wasn't worried about school or anything else. So I don't know if there was any thought about what would happen afterwards, other than paying attention to what the draft laws were, and recognizing, it was during that time that Kent State took place, and that was news. So we saw that and knew that there was continuing and increased unrest in the population, especially among young people. So I think we were aware of it. I was aware of it, but referring to what the draft laws were, up until 1970, 71, you could get a school deferment, and if you get that deferment and were actively involved in school, then you knew that you were pretty much protected from the draft, and along the way knew that that was going away because the draft was going to a lottery system.
So after your mission, you went to college for a year. What were your experiences while going to college during the time of the Vietnam War, and where many college-age men were being drafted and sent over?
Well, I actually only got 1/4 of college in because of when I got off my mission and when my birthday was and everything else. So, I don't recall that there was any strong feeling. I think the protesters, while they weren't popular in our area, were not treated with the animosity they were 2 or 3 years before. So there was a growing trend among the population to be protesting the war. But I don't know that I was ever really that actively involved in seeing it happen, just knew that it was there.
So you said that you weren't, like, actively involved, but were there any, like, of your, like, friends or any of, like, the people you were with that were actively involved
in protesting?
Yeah.
No, I mean, not real close friends. There were people that I knew that were involved, and I think the attitude at the time still was that it was kind of an un-American way to deal with it, to be actively protesting. If anything, they were looked down upon by me and my associates because we were all more of a conservative Bend at that time.
While in college, were there any protests that happened at your school specifically? And if so, how did they affect your learning experience?
I don't recall of any specifically. So yeah, that's not really relevant.
Were there any like protests around your area, or were they more like in? Because where did you go to college?
At Weber State up
Weber
in
State.
Ogden.
So were there any like at the U or BYU or any other colleges in the area where there were?
Not any that I really recall. If there were, it would have been in Salt Lake, and but nobody that I knew was involved on one side or the other of it.
So going back to Kent State while you were on your mission, was that like all over the news when it happened, and how did that like affect, not like your opinions, but like how did that affect people's like perspectives?
I think it affected everybody because it really kind of came down to people that were relatively peacefully protesting, and armed forces, the National Guard specifically, that were trying to quell it. And I think it just put a whole new seriousness to the whole thing, that there really was becoming a dividing line between actively protesting and actively staying conservative. So it raised a lot of thoughts, but I don't know that it really, in this area in Utah, I don't know that it really had that much of an effect.
After your like time in college, you decided to join the National Guard. Was there any specific reason that you left college to join the National Guard? And if so, what were they?
Yeah, because I was going to get drafted. The draft had taken on a lottery system. So they did a drawing, and depending on what date your birthday was, then you had a lottery number for when you were eligible for the draft. And if I remember correctly, you could no longer get a school deferment. So, and I remember that my draft number was 19, my lottery number. So once they started with number 1 and went down, if they needed more people to draft, they just went through. So I, because I'd already missed 2 years of going to college, I got a little bit desperate and started looking for National Guard or reserve units that I could get into, be away for 6 months to do basic training and so on, and then continue my life as a college student. So I scrambled and was able to join a National Guard unit in Salt Lake.
So you said you went to basic training for 6 months. What were your experiences at basic training?
Well, the 6 months was actually broken down a little bit. The first 3 months is basic training, and I went to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri for the basic training. So again, no protests, and I think the general feeling of people that I served with through basic training, probably there was a mix of I'm going to say roughly 30 to 40% of the people that I went to basic training with were draftees. 30 or 40% were people who had volunteered for enlistment, and the remaining were people that were either fulfilling a National Guard or Army Reserve obligation of going to basic. So it was pretty mixed. And I don't know that there was ever a lot of discussion, but I know me personally, I felt not that I was better off, but I felt like I was in a better position because I pretty much knew that I wasn't going to serve active duty after the basic training was over.
So before you like were in the National Guard and you were scrambling, how was your like feelings about like, because you were like, oh shoot, I'm if I don't find the place, I'm gonna be drafted. So how was your feelings towards the war during that?
I don't know that any of it was directed toward the war, other than taking the time out of my life, and I wasn't interested in going to war, but if I ended up getting drafted and did it, then so be it. But it wasn't. Um, it certainly wasn't to try and avoid the draft. It was just to accommodate what I wanted to do at the time, which was to go to school.
So after the National Guard, you like what were your like orders or like what were you like supposed to do on the National Guard?
Well, it depends on what unit you were in. I joined a evacuation hospital unit in Salt Lake. So going in, I knew that I'd get training as a combat medic, but also working in a more structured hospital environment. So after my 3 months of basic training, then I went to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, to medical corpsman training, and was there for approximately 3 months, and learned first aid as well as procedures to use in a hospital. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but I pretty much knew that at the end of that, then I just come back and my obligation would be weekend drills and 2-week summer camp every summer until my 6-year obligation in the National Guard was over with.
What did those like weekend like training sessions like enlist? Were there any like specific things that like you had to learn while you were there? Was it kind of just like refreshing every week?
No, it was different experiences. And the unit I was in worked pretty closely with local hospitals, so I know one weekend we spent the whole weekend when I believe it was St. Mark Hospital. They used to be down on the northwest part of Salt Lake. When they built a new hospital, we spent the whole weekend transporting patients from the existing hospital to the new hospital. So that was one experience where they needed people with some medical experience to do it. Other times we would have a drill right in the hospital and work with regular hospital staff doing things with patients. And then there would also be times that we'd have drills out in the field. And it was more military training than it was medic training. So, we shot weapons, we did what you would expect infantry military people to do, but knowing that my specialty specifically was as a medical corpsman, not as a combat infantry member.
So when you were like in like your 6 years of period, were there any times where there were like war veterans or like people coming back from the war that needed medical help when they came back that you had to help them with?
No, because typically if they needed medical help, they would go to a veterans hospital. We did have people that served on their weekend drills in the veterans hospital and just kind of supplemented the staff there. And I don't recall if I think I probably spent a couple of weekends there, but don't really have any recollection of it being anything other than medical treatment of people in that facility. Now, when we had the 2-week summer camp, most often we would go, it actually worked out that 2 out of every 3 years we would go to an established military hospital and supplement the people in that hospital for the weekend drill. And I know one summer camp we were in Denver, working at the military hospital over there. 1 year we were in San Francisco and worked at the military hospital in San Francisco. And then every third year, we would go and set up the medical unit in the field. And the primary thing that we were concerned with, because we were a mobile Army hospital, was being able to set it up and tear it down and move it to a different location, as if we were in combat, had to move the physical facility from one place to another. So we did a lot of drilling on setting up tents, tearing down tents, moving things from one place to the other.
Last kind of like section of the interview is the people that you knew that went over to the war and how they were affected. So one of the questions was, when they knew that they were being sent over, how did it affect their moods and attitudes?
I can only really recall one or two guys from high school that volunteered and wanted to go over, and they had a real gung-ho attitude. I want to be a killer and go over and defend the United States. But that was kind of the minority. Most people were kind of lackadaisical. If I get drafted, I get drafted. My preference is to go to school, but whatever. So the people that I went to school with, those that wanted to go over and serve, unless they had something. I know one friend wanted to be a helicopter pilot, and he enlisted just so that he'd get the helicopter training, and I mean, he was looking forward not so much to the combat part of it, but to learning to be taught how to be a helicopter pilot. Now, once I got into basic training, and we knew that a lot of those guys, and they knew also that they were going to be more than likely in a combat situation. I think the people that were National Guard and Reserve really supported them, but they also knew what they were getting into, and I don't know that any of them were terribly excited, but they were resigned to the fact that that's just the way it was going to be. There weren't any protests. It was just, hardcore military. It's like, this is what's going to happen.
So after the war kind of was starting to come to an end, when veterans were coming back, they were kind of like not disowned, but they weren't welcomed back. Was that like a different type of like, because it's a touchy subject, but like, was there any like sensitive feelings from like people that you knew?
Yeah, the people I knew thought it was ridiculous to castigate the people that were coming back. They had no choice in the matter for the most part. And even though there were isolated incidences in Vietnam where the military was overbearing and killed civilians and that sort of stuff, the overwhelming feeling among the public was still that the forces that we sent over there were honorable and did the right thing. So it really pretty much angered me that people were being treated poorly when they came home, because I didn't think they deserved to be.
So that pretty much sums up the interview. Thanks for coming and taking your time out of your day to.
All right. Yeah.
Help.
Hope that helps a little bit. I think it helped my perspective actually being in an active military situation during that time. It put a realness to the whole thing, and I know I was relieved that I didn't have to go, but in the back of my mind knew that anytime it was a possibility, and it wasn't something that I ever thought, well, I'll go to Canada or something like that, because it's just, that wasn't my nature, and it wasn't the nature of most people I knew.
All right, sweet.
All
Thank
right.
you again.
Thanks, buddy.